Briahna Joy Gray is being smeared on Twitter, and this has kind of gone all over the place. People have retweeted it, shared it, didn't watch the video, just went by the images. So this has happened. So this came from the Serfs. And what they did here is they took pictures from a segment on Rising, and I saw the episode. So I just want to be clear here on a segment on Rising where Briahna Joy Gray was talking about Tucker Carlson and the Great Replacement Theory. So they took these pictures. So you see a picture here where it says, is Tucker Carlson right? Then it goes on to say, to show, is Tucker Carlson right? Again, these are just screenshots. This is not the actual video. Then they showed this screenshot, Tucker is right. And then I believe there's one more here. Now, if you go down here, they said, please stop supplying Tucker Carlson with these masks. And then they put other images. This week, Tucker red-pilled 4 million people, and there is nothing liberals can do about it. And this image here where it says, Fox News, we have to fight to preserve our nation and heritage. And here, if you believe in multiculturalism, then by definition, you're not going to rise to defend your culture because it's equal to every other culture. So these are clips, screenshots from some of the things that Tucker Carlson has said. Here's another one here. Don't miss this one of Tucker's best performances. And this is, the story is rape allegations rock Maryland high school. So I'm going to play part of that video. But one thing I do want to say is this. This is something I've seen happen often on Twitter where people will post clips or images and they won't give the full context. So I could tell by some of the responses in this thread, some of the people didn't even watch the video. I could just tell, like they saw this. And if you look at some of the comments, and so this seems to be where there's the disagreement. So someone posted here, in case people don't read my other comment, I don't know BJG except for her being a Bernie person back in 2020, but this seems really disingenuous given the context of the entire segment. So she posted the link to the video, she or he, excuse me, I shouldn't assume. And the Serfs responded here and said, I did, Tucker Carlson is not race neutral. So that seems to be where there is the disagreement. However, that being said, even if you disagree, some of the responses that I saw where people were calling her right wing, I felt like that was exaggerating. And like I said, if you go through, I'm not going to go through all of them for the sake of time, but if you go through the thread, you can tell that some of these people did not actually watch the video. So I'm going to go ahead and show you part of that video so you can see what people may be referring to. I think some people in the chat were exaggerating, to be honest.
Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, of course, as you all know by now, 10 people were murdered in a grocery store in Buffalo, New York by a self-described white supremacist who specifically sought out a predominantly black community and traveled 200 miles to kill black people. Among those killed were Roberta Drury, age 32, who loved Whitney Houston, Ruth Whitfield, 86, a devoted grandmother, Celestine Chaney, 65, a breast cancer survivor, and Andre McNeil, 53, who was at the supermarket picking up a cake for his 3-year-old son. Although some are trying to cast this homicidal event as just another murder in the context of a country that is always dealing with the consequences of having more guns than people, racism is not incidental to this story. In a lengthy document left by the killer, he explicitly lamented that because white populations on average have lower birth rates, that white people are making up a smaller and smaller proportion of the global and national population. To him, this is a problem. And his solution? To kill black people with a gun on which he had written, "Here's your reparations." As you've likely heard by now, the idea that white Americans are threatened by demographic changes is known as the Great Replacement theory. It's a narrative that first gained traction on explicitly white supremacist websites before being mainstreamed by conservative commentators. In the wake of the Buffalo massacre, Tucker Carlson has come under scrutiny as perhaps the most high-profile purveyor of this narrative. He, of course, does not advocate for physical violence against non-white populations or anyone. In fact, Tucker Carlson is fastidiously race-neutral in his language, frequently adopting the famous colorblind quote from Martin Luther King, and stressing that his interest is in protecting American culture and the American way of life.
So that part I do disagree with. I don't think that Tucker Carlson is race neutral, not based on some of the comments that I've seen him make, whether it's on Fox News or on other outlets as well. I don't think that he's race neutral. However, that still doesn't mean that Briahna Joy Gray is right wing. So I can disagree with some things. Like, I don't agree with Bri on everything. I don't agree with her on strategy, the political strategy, but I still wouldn't say she's right wing. And that's the smear that's going around now. So let's continue.
In fact, Fox News just tweeted this out on Monday. So what does Carlson say that has some liberals accusing him of culpability? Let's take a listen.
Now, I know that the left and all the little gatekeepers on Twitter become literally hysterical if you use the term replacement, if you suggest that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world. But they become hysterical because that's what's happening, actually. Let's just say it. That's true. Let's say that again for emphasis, because it is the secret to the entire immigration debate. Demographic change is the key to the Democratic Party's political ambitions. In other words, you're being replaced and there's nothing you can do about it. So shut up. I mean, they're trying to change the population of the United States, and they hate it when you say that because it's true. Our country's being invaded by the rest of the world. Let me just state unequivocally, the country's being stolen from American citizens as we watch. In political terms, this policy is called the Great Replacement, the replacement of legacy Americans with more obedient people from faraway countries.
Now, liberals interpret these statements about, America being stolen, et cetera, as dog whistles, as veiled references to a white way of life. But Tucker Carlson never says that explicitly. And the more liberals accuse him of broadly being racist without being able to articulate why what he said is wrong, the more Tucker gains credibility. And the more he entrenches his coveted victim status. He's primed his audience for exactly that type of "you're a racist" attack. Take a listen.
A quick programming note: as the debate over immigration has risen to the top of the news in recent weeks, a number of figures on the left have denounced this show as racist. It's notable that not a single one of them has offered any evidence to support that slur or even bothered to rebut the arguments that we make every night. They just make loud noises about white supremacy and assume that's an argument. Of course, the rest of the media dutifully repeat that.
Tucker's right. Liberals have largely been unspecific about what their concerns are with the Great Replacement rhetoric. But I will be. Tucker claims that his problem with immigration is that it will fundamentally change the voter rolls of the country to benefit Democrats. This is an explicitly political argument, not a racial one, which is why the claims of racism fall flat. But there's no need to evoke racism to find some fault here. Take a listen to this.
Really? The worst?
So I will say, I just want to add in a tidbit here. I do understand what she's saying. I have heard Tucker Carlson talk about immigration. Other than that, I don't really watch that show. I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't really watch that show unless that I'm looking for some type of a story. But I felt like those examples that were used, I felt like those were pretty tame compared to some of the other things that I've heard Tucker Carlson say on that show. And it's not just Tucker Carlson. Laura Ingraham, she's another one. She's made comments about Black people before on Fox News. So I think those probably weren't the best examples to use. I would refer back to some of the commentary that he had after George Floyd. That's what I would have done. But that still doesn't mean that she's right wing. So here we go.
Attack on our democracy in 160 years? How about the Immigration Act of 1965? That law completely changed the composition of America's voter rolls purely to benefit the Democratic Party. That seems like kind of an assault on democracy, a permanent one. But no, that was a good thing because in the end, it helped Joe Biden.
So in that clip, Tucker Carlson argues that the Immigration Act of 1965 was the greatest attack on our democracy since the Civil War. So what was the Immigration Act of 1965? Well, it eliminated the national origins quota system. Before 1965, Southern and Eastern Europeans, Asians, and other non-Western European or Northern European groups were severely limited in their ability to immigrate to this country. The Immigration Act of 1965 undid earlier discriminatory immigration acts like the Chinese Exclusion Act that explicitly barred racial groups not on any type of merit-based system, but because they were considered to be from culturally or racially inferior countries. Now, the immigration system that Tucker speaks about nostalgically did get some big name approval from across the pond. One notable national leader said admiringly of our system, quote, "The American Union categorically refuses the immigration of physically unhealthy elements and simply excludes the immigration of certain races." End quote. It's a nice compliment, tarnished somewhat by the fact that it's a quote from Mein Kampf. Tucker expressly laments the end of an immigration system that established quotas based on the perceived unworthiness of not just non-whites, but Italians, Eastern Europeans, as well as Asians and Africans. Now, Italians and other European groups were considered white prior to the 20th century, but if you think their inclusion on this list makes the list not racist, that's perfectly fine. But it is reflective of a bias that has nothing to do with American ideals, whether these groups share American values or whether they make good citizens. And that's
So I want to chime in here for just a second in reference to changing the voter population for immigrants that come to the United States. First of all, when you come here as an immigrant, like you can't just vote. Like it's not that simple. Second of all, people that I know that have had to deal with immigration here in the United States, it took them like 10 years to get citizenship here. They couldn't vote. So I don't know about this. Like, I'm just going to be honest with you guys. I don't know about this. And then it's also assuming that people who are immigrating here to the United States are automatically going to vote Democrat. Is that necessarily the case? Because if you were to look at the Latino community, do they automatically vote Democrat? No, some of them vote conservative, vote for the Republicans. So I don't know.
what Tucker says he cares about: the rights of American citizens and the preservation of an American way of life. In the earlier clip, he complained that Democrats were replacing old voters with new voters on the voter rolls. But I'm a little confused about that because all voters are American. Definitionally, only Americans can vote. So we have to ask what makes the new Americans inferior in his eyes to the old Americans. Why are legacy Americans more equal than non-legacy Americans? What makes someone who has worked hard and struggled through America's difficult immigration process, who has learned the presidents and state capitals and answers to questions that most native-born Americans probably can't answer, less worthy of participating in the society than someone whose family came in, let's say, the great immigration wave of the early 20th century? What is it about their case?
This part right here.
And that's what Tucker says he cares about: the rights of American citizens and the preservation of an American way of life. In the earlier clip, he complained that Democrats were replacing old voters with new voters on the voter rolls. But I'm a little confused about that because all voters are American. Definitionally, only Americans can vote. So we have to ask what makes the new Americans inferior in his eyes to the old Americans.
But the other thing I would mention here too, I think it's very clear when Tucker Carlson talks about immigration, he's talking about a certain type of immigrant. He's not talking about people who are immigrating to the United States from like Norway and Sweden and Denmark. He's talking about people of color who immigrate to the United States. So I think it's important to mention that. That's what I would have added in here. So I don't know. I'm not agreeing. Like I understand where she's coming from, but at the same time, I think it's important to mention there's a certain type of immigrant that he's talking about.
Why are legacy Americans more equal than non-legacy Americans? What makes someone who has worked hard and struggled through America's difficult immigration process, who has learned the presidents and state capitals and answers to questions that most native-born Americans probably can't answer, less worthy of participating in the society than someone whose family came in, let's say, the great immigration wave of the early 20th century. What is it about their character that makes them a bad fit? Now, Tucker is right about something. The Democrats have hoped that changing demographics will inure to their political benefit. Pundits like Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White, How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority, have traipsed the political circuit for years making this argument. And I hate it. In my view, people like Phillips are part of the rod at the center of the Democratic Party. They are responsible in significant part for its failures and are culpable in part for the rise of replacement theory. In a 2018 article at The Intercept, I criticized Phillips for arguing that America's growing non-white population is key to the Democratic Party's success, and that, quote, Democrats should not waste money appealing to white swing voters.
But the Democratic Party is actually losing black voters. That's the thing. The Democratic Party is losing black voters. Look at the numbers. I don't know.
The Democratic Party is useless today in part because it's been following Phillips's advice. For years now, the party has completely abandoned any effort to persuade voters of any race to pass the policies they actually want, or even to speak with them with a modicum of respect. Part of the reason is that advisors like Phillips, a senior advisor at top liberal think tank Center for American Progress, believe that white votes are a deplorable lost cause. And non-white voters, they think, will inevitably vote for Democrats, no matter how much the Democratic Party abuses them. Remember when Joe Biden told black voters in 2020 that if they didn't vote for him, they ain't black? That was just a Democrat saying out loud what so many of them believe, that non-white votes belong to them. They don't need to be earned. But
that's why I keep telling people stop voting for them.
They were wrong. As I wrote back then, though much is made of the browning of America, the country is still 70% white. And electoral strategies that are wholly dismissive of that population set themselves at an unnecessary disadvantage. America's browning is largely attributed to the fact that Hispanics constitute the largest growing ethnic group in the country. But a majority of Hispanics identify as white, and 1/3 continue to support Donald Trump. The irony is that Phillips's theory hasn't borne out. Democrats have so totally abandoned the working class, voters of all colors, that growing numbers of non-whites are looking for alternatives. Among Congress members, Republicans are the more vocal anti-interventionists right now. Marjorie Taylor Greene is out here outflanking squad members on the absurdity of giving aid to Ukraine while American babies starve. And Latinos are an important part of the Republican base. Now, this reality undermines Tucker's argument. Although he's right that Democrats hoped immigration changes would help them politically, they haven't. Not really. Not as much as people thought. Tucker doesn't have a strong electoral argument against immigrant populations who, on the whole, are more politically conservative and more religious than native-born Americans. And a slight liberal bias among first-generation immigrants disappears after a generation or two. They're ripe for Republican picking. And without the electoral case against immigration, I think it's fair to ask a hypothetical, as Tucker often does. What could be motivating him to see immigration as such an existential threat? Whose existence is really imperiled right now? The white American lifespan is declining right now for the first time in American history. The opioid pandemic is a scourge made worse by the COVID pandemic and the lack of universal health care. Wages haven't kept up with inflation, and both corporate parties are aligned against raising the minimum wage.
But there's one more thing I do want to mention here. The other big thing is that people aren't having kids. A lot of people who are millennials, like my generation, millennials, and then Gen Z, are not having children. That's another reason for the population decline. But people also aren't doing that because the planet kind of sucks right now. Climate change is a huge issue. We're not paid a living wage. You have all this student loan debt. So that's another problem too, is people aren't having kids. And that's not just Black Americans, Latino Americans, that's also white Americans as well.
No, we haven't had a minimum wage raise for the longest period in American history. And even though Americans have never worked harder for less. When Carlson focuses his ire on corruption by elites, he's right on the nose. But the fact that he fully understands that it's elite capture that's causing so many Americans to hurt right now makes it difficult for me to understand how he thinks that a relatively small and powerless immigrant group deserves as much focus as the billionaires stalling our wages, poisoning our baby food, and ruining the country. And focusing on small, powerless individuals rather than big corporations in control is dangerous, literally. We need to be clear about what people like the Buffalo shooter are talking about when he talks about the Great Replacement. They're not just talking about the natural immigration and population trends that have existed since the first immigrants walked out of East Africa. To replace something is to put something new in the place of something old. It implies the old thing is gotten rid of, not simply added to. The threat suggested by Great Replacement isn't just low white birth rates or average immigration rates. It's something more pernicious, something akin to white genocide. And in fact, the Buffalo murderer describes the declining birth rate as, quote, mass genocide.
One thing I want to add too, in reference to the Buffalo shooter, he specifically targeted Black people. He had already been to the supermarket before. He had already scoped out the scene. So he drove all those hours to get there, checked out the scene, went to even search for neighborhoods that had predominantly large amounts of Black people. So he had already surveyed the scene. And so again, in reference to what Tucker Carlson was saying about immigration, it's not like the shooter was like, let me look for the neighborhood that has the most immigrants. And no, he specifically targeted Black people.
And genocide is defined as the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. That's not what immigrants do. That's what the Buffalo shooter did. He hunted down Black people so they could be replaced with so-called legacy Americans, a term I find kind of funny given that few communities have as deep historical roots in America as Black Americans. After all, the Atlantic slave trade was abolished in 1808, meaning that the American descendants of slaves arrived here sometime before then. We predate the huge wave of European immigrants that arrived in this country between 1880 and 1920. 20 million immigrants arrived during those 40 years, nearly double the number of Africans forcibly enslaved and sold into bondage in the Americas over the span of 400 years. At this country's founding, Black Americans constituted 20% of the population and comprised 16.5% after the Civil War. But that didn't last long. By 1920, at the end of the great wave of European immigration, the original racial fabric of this country had changed. The legacy Americans, Black Americans, had largely been replaced.
I really don't like that term, legacy Americans. And I know people use it, but I really don't like it. Because what do you mean by legacy Americans? I mean, technically, this isn't even our country. Like, I hate that. I hate that like legacy term.
Now, I'm not sincerely arguing for a Black version of replacement theory. I'm drawing this historical analogy to make a point. The idea that rapidly changing demographics can politically disadvantage a population is nothing new, nor is the idea that some white Americans are so threatened by changing demographics that they feel empowered to murder Blacks, Jews, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans. Elites in this country have always understood that the best way to distract the public from their looting of wages and public wealth is to pit people against each other, to divide them up by their differences. Mainstream news pundits on both Fox and MSNBC would like to use racial strife as a deflection from core economic issues that hurt working people of all ethnic and national origins.
I'm going to go ahead and stop it there because I'm looking at the time. I actually can't play the entire video, but the point that I want to focus on is you've heard the majority of it and you can still listen to the rest of it if you go to the Hill. But the point that I wanted to make here is that enough to call someone right wing? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight on our call in. If you happen to agree with the conservative on one particular issue, or maybe it's a couple other issues, does that necessarily mean that you're right wing? Because that's what people were going on to say about her. If you look at the comments, like it's a long thread. People were going on to say that she's right wing and she's trying to get the right wing money now. And it was really bad. It's really bad. I'm not going to show all that on here, but anyway, you get the point. But what I'm trying to say is, does that mean you can't agree with someone on the right about something? Because this is a problem now. There's a lot of people getting smeared. They're being called like right wing. This is happening to, it's been happening to Jimmy Dore, but it's starting to happen with other people now too. Anytime you agree with someone on the right about anything, they smear you and they call you right wing. And my question is, does that necessarily make you right wing? Now, based on the conversation that she gave there, I don't think that says she's right wing. I don't agree with everything that she said in that segment, but I don't think that means she's right wing. And people will take little clips like that and they'll post them on Twitter. In this case, these were just images. They weren't even actual video clips. They were just images, and they post them on Twitter and let people just form their own opinion and just go off the rails. And the comments were pretty gross. Like, I'm just being honest. But one thing that particularly like stood out to me is the number of white people that were attacking her in that thread, trying to tell her what race is, what racism is. And I just like to myself, like, this is wow. Justin, what you say? I get what Briahna was trying to say. Maybe she was trying to be much too technical, I guess. Maybe. Yeah, like, I don't agree with everything she said. I don't think that Tucker Carlson is race neutral. I'm sorry. Like I said, some of those examples that were shown, yes, I get it, him talking about immigration, but there are other examples that could have been used. So I don't agree with that. But the way that she was attacked was ridiculous. And smearing people and calling them right wing when you know damn well they're not right wing it's crazy. It's ridiculous. But that's what's happening now.